The woman sitting in seat 14C would be removed from the plane before takeoff, and less than an hour later, people at the highest level of the airline would be speaking her name. Angela Carter sat quietly beside the window, a leather portfolio resting on her lap, and a paperback book tucked neatly beside it. Around her, passengers settled into their seats, lifted bags into overhead compartments, and exchanged the familiar conversations that filled almost every flight. A young couple discussed vacation plans. A businessman rushed through emails before departure. A family helped their children fasten seat belts. Everything felt ordinary. Angela preferred ordinary. Years of success had taught her that the less attention she attracted, the more she learned about the people around her. Dressed in a simple navy blazer and comfortable travel clothes, she looked like any other passenger preparing for a routine flight. No one would have guessed that major corporations waited for her decisions. No one would have guessed that boardrooms across the country monitored investments connected to her company. And that was exactly how she liked it. Outside the aircraft window, ground crews moved beneath the afternoon sun while baggage carts crossed the tarmac. Inside the cabin, flight attendants completed final boarding procedures. Angela glanced at her watch and reviewed a few notes inside her portfolio. The following morning would include meetings worth millions of dollars. Yet at that moment, she was focused on something far simpler, arriving on time. A few rows ahead, passengers discussed a minor delay involving boarding procedures. The conversation quickly faded into background noise. Angela turned another page in her notebook and made several brief observations regarding an upcoming presentation. Her handwriting was neat and deliberate. Across the aisle, an older passenger struggled to place a carry-on bag in the overhead compartment. Without hesitation, Angela stood and helped lift the suitcase into place. The passenger smiled gratefully. "Thank you." Angela returned the smile. "Happy to help." It was a small interaction, one of dozens that happen every day during air travel. Yet it revealed something important about her character. Despite decades of achievement, she never considered herself above simple acts of kindness. Several minutes passed. Boarding continued. A flight attendant walked through the cabin conducting routine checks. Passengers settled deeper into their seats as departure time approached. Angela reopened her portfolio and reviewed another report. The numbers on the page represented months of negotiations and planning. Entire teams had contributed to the work. Still, she remained calm. Pressure had become familiar long ago. Near the front of the aircraft, a brief conversation between crew members drew little attention. Most passengers ignored it. Angela certainly did. Her focus remained on her work. Unknown to her, a misunderstanding had already begun somewhere beyond the cabin. A comment, an observation, a concern passed from one employee to another. Nothing dramatic, nothing verified, just the beginning of an assumption. Angela knew none of this. She simply continued reading while passengers around her prepared for departure. The aircraft door remained open. More travelers entered. A flight attendant smiled as she directed people toward available seats. The atmosphere remained routine, comfortable, predictable. Yet hidden beneath the normal rhythm of pre-flight activity, a decision was slowly taking shape. A decision involving a woman nobody seemed to notice. Angela closed her portfolio for a moment and looked around the cabin. Faces reflected exhaustion, anticipation, excitement, and distraction. People from different backgrounds, different cities, and different lives, all sharing the same journey. She smiled softly. Travel had always reminded her how connected strangers could be. Then she returned her attention to her notes. What she could not know was that before this flight ever left the ground, strangers would make judgments about her without knowing her name, her story, or her accomplishments. And before the day was over, the consequences of those judgments would travel far beyond seat 14C and reach offices at the very top of the airline itself. The aircraft door remained open as final boarding procedures continued. Most passengers paid little attention to the activity around them. They were focused on their own schedules, their own destinations, and their own concerns. Angela Carter sat quietly in seat 14C reviewing notes inside her portfolio. The calm atmosphere around her gave no indication that events were already moving in a different direction somewhere beyond the cabin. Near the front of the aircraft, a flight attendant spoke quietly with a supervisor who had stepped aboard moments earlier. The conversation appeared routine at first. A few brief words, a glance toward the middle section of the cabin, Another exchange. Then the supervisor left and disappeared back into the jet bridge. Nobody seemed concerned. Nobody except one crew member who continued looking toward Angela from time to time. Angela remained unaware. She closed one document and opened another, carefully reviewing figures connected to an upcoming investment presentation. Numbers mattered. Details mattered. Assumptions did not. That principle had guided her throughout her career. Unfortunately, not everyone shared that philosophy. Outside the aircraft, information was moving through channels faster than facts. A concern expressed by one employee became a discussion between two employees. The discussion became a report. The report gradually changed shape as it moved from person to person. By the time it reached airport operations, it no longer resembled the original observation. It sounded more serious, more urgent, more certain. The problem was that certainty had arrived before verification. Jason Murphy, an airport operations manager, received a brief update while reviewing departure schedules. He frowned as he listened. Was any of this confirmed? He asked. The employee delivering the information hesitated. Not exactly. Jason looked dissatisfied. Then why are we treating it as fact? No clear answer followed. Meanwhile, inside the aircraft, passengers continued settling into their seats. A teenager listened to music. A businessman reviewed a presentation. A mother handed snacks to her children. Ordinary moments unfolded throughout the cabin. Angela glanced out the window and watched ground crews preparing for departure. Everything seemed normal. Then a flight attendant entered the cockpit carrying information that had already passed through multiple hands. Captain Michael Reeves listened carefully. He was a respected pilot with decades of experience and a reputation for decisive leadership. Throughout his career, he had learned that hesitation sometimes created problems. Quick decisions often prevented them. Unfortunately, quick decisions could also create new problems when built on incomplete information. The report he received contained concerns that had never been fully verified. Yet something about the way it was presented gave it weight. Captain Reeves asked several questions. The answers remained vague. Still, the concern lingered. The more he considered it, the more convinced he became that action might be necessary. He did not know Angela Carter. He had never heard her name. He knew nothing about her career, her reputation, or her accomplishments. All he had was a version of events delivered through layers of assumptions. Back in seat 14C, Angela finished reviewing her notes and placed the documents neatly inside her portfolio. She noticed a young traveler across the aisle struggling with a complicated connection schedule on a mobile app. After a brief conversation, she offered a simple suggestion that helped clarify the route. The traveler smiled gratefully. "Thank you. I was getting completely lost." Angela laughed softly. Airports have a way of doing that. The interaction lasted less than a minute. Yet it reflected the same calm professionalism she showed to everyone she met. Several rows away, a crew member observed the exchange. For a brief moment, doubt appeared on her face. The woman in seat 14C did not seem threatening. She did not seem disruptive. She seemed thoughtful, patient, and courteous. Yet by then, the machinery of assumption was already moving. Inside the cockpit, Captain Reeves made a decision. He believed he was protecting order. He believed he was acting responsibly. What he did not realize was that the decision forming in his mind would soon place him at the center of a situation that would travel far beyond this aircraft. And within minutes, the woman quietly sitting beside the window would become the focus of the entire flight. The decision moved quickly after that. Captain Michael Reeves stepped out of the cockpit and entered the cabin with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Conversations gradually faded as passengers noticed him approaching. Pilots rarely left the flight deck during boarding unless something required attention. Heads turned. Curious eyes followed him. Angela Carter remained seated by the window, unaware that she was the destination of his walk. Her attention was focused on a report resting inside her portfolio. She looked up only when the captain stopped beside her row. For a brief moment, the cabin became unusually quiet. Captain Reeves maintained a professional expression, but his tone carried unmistakable authority. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you." Angela closed her portfolio calmly and looked up. Of course. Several nearby passengers immediately became interested. The sight of a pilot addressing a passenger directly was unusual enough to attract attention. Captain Reeves glanced briefly toward the aisle before speaking again. I am going to ask you to gather your belongings and step off the aircraft. The words seemed to freeze the air around them. Angela blinked once. Not because she was frightened, because she genuinely did not understand. May I ask why? She said politely. The captain crossed his arms. A concern has been reported to me. Angela waited for further explanation. None came. What concern? She asked. Captain Reeves hesitated for only a second. I have made my decision. Several passengers exchanged looks. Some leaned slightly into the aisle to hear better. Angela remained composed. With respect, Captain, I do not know what concern you are referring to. Her voice remained calm and measured. She did not sound defensive. She sounded confused. The distinction mattered, although very few people seemed to notice. The captain stood firm. I am requesting that you leave the aircraft. Angela studied his face for a moment. Years of leadership had taught her how to recognize certainty. More importantly, she had learned how difficult it was to reason with people who had already decided they were correct. Have I violated a policy? She asked. No. Have I disrupted anyone? That is not the issue. Then perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. The captain's expression hardened slightly. The decision has already been made. Those words traveled through the cabin. Passengers heard them. Flight attendants heard them. Even crew members who privately questioned the situation remained silent. The authority of the pilot carried enormous weight. Most people assumed that if a captain made such a decision, there had to be a good reason. That assumption spread quickly. Angela noticed it happening in real time. Eyes that had previously ignored her were now studying her. Strangers were quietly reaching conclusions despite knowing almost nothing about the situation. Yet she refused to match assumption with emotion. I understand, she said softly. The answer seemed to surprise the captain. Perhaps he expected resistance. Perhaps he expected an argument. Instead, Angela simply nodded. Around the cabin, people watched closely. Some appeared sympathetic. Others appeared convinced that the captain must know something they did not. Angela slowly gathered her notebook, her phone, and her portfolio. Every movement was deliberate. Every movement was calm. She stood and adjusted the strap of her bag. The captain stepped aside to clear the aisle. For a moment their eyes met. Angela offered a polite nod. I hope whatever information you received is reviewed carefully, she said. The statement contained no anger, no threat, no accusation, only quiet disappointment. Then she stepped into the aisle. The cabin remained silent as she began walking toward the front of the aircraft. Dozens of strangers watched her pass. Some avoided eye contact. Others stared openly. Angela kept her head high and continued forward. What none of them realized was that the woman walking toward the exit was not simply leaving a flight. She was walking toward a chain of events that would soon reach far beyond the aircraft and into offices occupied by people far more powerful than anyone on board could imagine. Angela Carter continued walking toward the front of the aircraft with her portfolio held firmly at her side. The aisle seemed longer than it had a few minutes earlier. Every step carried the weight of dozens of eyes watching her. Some passengers looked uncomfortable. Others appeared curious. A few seemed convinced that the captain's decision must have been justified. Human nature often preferred certainty over questions. Angela understood that better than most. She had spent years sitting in boardrooms where assumptions frequently arrived before facts. What surprised her was how quickly the same thing could happen inside an airplane cabin. As she reached the front section, a passenger near the aisle shook his head and muttered something under his breath. Another passenger exchanged a glance with a companion. Then it happened. A pair of hands began clapping somewhere near the middle of the aircraft. The sound echoed through the cabin. One clap, then another. For a brief moment, the noise stood alone. Angela paused only long enough to hear it. She did not turn around. She did not react. Yet the sound carried through the aircraft with startling clarity. A few seconds later, another passenger joined in. Then another. Not everyone participated. In fact, most passengers remained silent. But it did not take many voices to create the impression of approval. The applause spread just enough to fill the cabin with a feeling Angela would never forget. It was not the volume that mattered. It was the message. People were celebrating a decision without knowing the facts behind it. They were applauding a conclusion they had never investigated. Near the front galley, one flight attendant lowered her eyes. Another looked visibly uncomfortable. Even some passengers who remained silent seemed unsure whether they should be witnessing the moment at all. Angela continued forward with the same calm pace. She refused to give strangers control over her dignity. The applause gradually faded as she approached the aircraft door. By then, even several passengers who had initially joined in appeared uncertain. Once emotion passes, reflection often follows. Unfortunately, reflection usually arrives too late. Captain Reeves remained near the front of the cabin. His expression revealed little. He appeared satisfied that order had been maintained. He believed he had made the correct decision. Angela stopped briefly near the aircraft exit and looked toward him. Her voice remained calm. "I hope one day you discover what actually happened here." The captain did not respond immediately. "I acted on information provided to me." Angela nodded. "That is exactly what concerns me." There was no hostility in her words. No accusation. Only disappointment. Then she stepped through the aircraft doorway and entered the jet bridge. Behind her, the cabin remained unusually quiet. The applause was gone now. All that remained was the lingering discomfort of a moment nobody could take back. Inside the jet bridge, airport supervisor Emma Collins waited alongside a ground employee. Both appeared uncertain. Neither seemed fully aware of why Angela had been removed. They only knew the captain had issued the instruction. Angela adjusted the strap of her bag and continued walking. The airport terminal beyond the jet bridge appeared busy and ordinary. Travelers hurried toward connections. Announcements echoed overhead. Life continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet for Angela, something important had just been revealed. Not about herself, about other people. She understood that titles often influenced how individuals behaved. Respect frequently arrived after recognition instead of before it. That reality saddened her more than the removal itself. As she entered the terminal, several airline employees glanced in her direction before returning to their work. None recognized her. None understood who had just stepped off the aircraft. To them, she was simply another passenger. But only a short distance away, someone was about to see her face and instantly realize that a very serious mistake had been made. And when that realization occurred, the consequences of the applause, the assumptions, and the captain's decision would begin moving far beyond the gate where it all started. Angela Carter stepped into the terminal and moved away from the gate with the same quiet dignity she had carried throughout the entire ordeal. The sounds of the airport surrounded her once again. Boarding announcements echoed overhead. Travelers hurried toward connections. Coffee carts rolled past. To everyone around her, it was just another ordinary afternoon. To Angela, it was a reminder that life rarely pauses long enough for people to question their assumptions. She found an empty seat near a large window overlooking the runway and placed her portfolio beside her. For the first time since leaving the aircraft, she allowed herself a slow breath. Not because she was angry, because she was disappointed. Years of experience had taught her that titles often changed how people behaved. What saddened her was how often basic respect depended on those titles being known. Several gates away, Jason Murphy was reviewing operational reports when he noticed a familiar face across the terminal. At first, he thought he was mistaken. He looked again. Then he stood so quickly that the chair behind him nearly rolled backward. There was no mistake. He recognized Angela immediately. Months earlier, he had attended an aviation investment conference where she delivered the keynote address. Her presentation had become one of the most discussed sessions of the entire event. Jason remembered the packed auditorium, the standing ovation, and the executives lining up afterward just to speak with her. Yet now she sat alone in an airport terminal, quietly reading notes from her portfolio. Confused, Jason walked closer. As he approached, he noticed something unusual. Several airline employees were discussing an incident involving a passenger who had recently been removed from a flight. Then he heard a seat number, 14C. His stomach tightened. The pieces connected instantly. Jason glanced from the employee's back toward Angela. Suddenly, the situation looked very different. He approached carefully. "Ms. Carter." Angela looked up and offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon." Jason stopped for a moment, still processing what he was seeing. "I attended your presentation in Denver last year." Angela nodded. "That was a wonderful event." Jason hesitated. "Were you just removed from Flight 728? The question hung in the air. Angela closed her notebook. "I was asked to leave, yes." Jason felt his heart sink. The calm way she said it somehow made the situation feel worse. There must be some mistake. Angela offered a small smile. "That possibility crossed my mind as well." Jason looked toward the gate in disbelief. He knew enough about the airline's leadership structure to understand that this was not an ordinary passenger. More importantly, he knew Angela's reputation. She was known throughout the industry for professionalism, integrity, and influence. None of what he was hearing made sense. For several seconds, he stood silently, trying to decide what to do next. Then he made a decision. "Would you mind waiting here for a moment?" Angela looked at him calmly. "Of course." Jason nodded and stepped away. His pace quickened immediately. The farther he walked, the more concerned he became, because he understood something nobody else at that gate understood yet. The woman sitting quietly by the window was not simply a passenger who had been treated unfairly. She was someone whose name carried weight in boardrooms across the aviation industry. And within minutes, that realization would begin moving upward through levels of leadership that few employees ever reached. Jason Murphy moved quickly through the terminal, his mind racing faster with every step. He had worked in aviation for more than a decade and had seen countless operational issues, customer complaints, and scheduling problems. But this felt different. Very different. The image of Angela Carter sitting calmly by the window remained fixed in his mind. Most passengers who had just been removed from a flight would be frustrated, angry, or demanding answers. Angela had done none of those things. She had simply accepted the decision and carried herself with quiet dignity. That alone said something. The fact that she was one of the most respected executives in the industry said even more. Meanwhile, Angela remained seated near the large terminal window. Aircraft moved across the runway outside while the evening sun painted long shadows across the airport. Travelers passed in every direction, unaware of the events that had just unfolded. Angela opened her notebook again and reviewed several pages of notes. To anyone watching, she appeared focused entirely on work. In reality, she was reflecting on something much larger. She had spent years helping organizations improve culture, leadership, and accountability. Yet moments like today reminded her how easily people could abandon those principles when assumptions entered the picture. Her phone vibrated softly. A message appeared from her executive assistant asking whether she would still make the scheduled meeting later that evening. Angela looked at the screen for several seconds before responding. Then she stood and walked toward a quieter corner of the terminal. The movement drew no attention. Nobody realized that the next 30 seconds would quietly set powerful forces into motion. She selected a contact and placed a call. The line connected almost immediately. "Good afternoon," Angela said. Her tone remained calm and professional. The voice on the other end greeted her warmly. Angela listened for several seconds before speaking again. "There has been an incident involving one of your airline's flights." A pause followed. She listened carefully. "No, nobody was harmed." Another pause. "I simply believe certain decisions deserve review." Her expression never changed. There was no anger in her voice. No dramatic accusation. Only calm certainty. Several more seconds passed. Then she spoke again. "I would appreciate it if the appropriate leadership team received a complete report." Silence followed as she listened. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you. That is all I needed." The call ended. 28 seconds. Less than half a minute. Angela slipped the phone back into her bag and returned to her seat. To anyone nearby, the conversation seemed completely ordinary. Yet somewhere far above the terminal floor, phones were already beginning to ring. Emails were being forwarded. Questions were being asked. Information that had previously traveled through assumptions was about to be examined through facts. Across the airport, Jason had already begun sharing what he knew with senior personnel. The reactions were immediate. Some employees looked confused. Others looked concerned. A few simply stared in disbelief. One manager asked him twice if he was absolutely certain about the identification. Jason answered the same way both times. "I know exactly who she is." Back at the gate, Flight 728 was finally preparing for departure. Captain Michael Reeves believed the matter was finished. Passengers were settling back into routine conversations. Crew members focused on departure procedures. Life aboard the aircraft appeared to be returning to normal. Yet what none of them realized was that the situation was no longer confined to the cabin. The decision made on that airplane had already escaped the gate. It was moving upward through layers of leadership with surprising speed. Angela looked through the terminal window at the aircraft preparing to leave without her. She showed no bitterness, no resentment, only quiet reflection. Then she opened her notebook and wrote a single sentence across the bottom of the page. Facts should arrive before conclusions. She closed the notebook, folded her hands, and waited. Because experience had taught her something important. The truth often moves slowly at first, but once it begins moving, it becomes very difficult to stop. 15 minutes after Angela Carter ended the call, the first report reached a level of leadership far above the airport terminal. What began as a routine operational update quickly became something else entirely. In a quiet office overlooking downtown skyscrapers hundreds of miles away, Charles Whitmore reviewed documents at the end of a long day. As chairman of the board, he rarely involved himself in routine passenger matters. Entire departments existed to handle those situations. Yet when his assistant entered carrying an urgent summary, one detail immediately captured his attention. A familiar name. Charles lowered his glasses and read the report a second time. Then a third. The room became silent. "Is this accurate?" he asked. His assistant hesitated. "We are still confirming details." Charles looked up, then confirmed them immediately. The assistant left without another word. For decades, Charles had built a reputation as a careful leader. He disliked reacting to rumors. He disliked incomplete information even more. Yet something about the report disturbed him. Not because of Angela's position, because the sequence of events made little sense. Within minutes, additional information began arriving. Passenger records, employee statements, timeline summaries. Every document painted a similar picture. A concern had been raised. Assumptions had spread. Decisions had followed. Verification had arrived last. Charles leaned back in his chair and slowly exhaled. The order of those events troubled him. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Angela remained seated near the terminal window. She had no idea where the information was traveling, nor did she seem particularly interested. She spent the time reviewing notes and responding to messages from her team. Her composure remained unchanged. Nearby, Jason Murphy continued receiving questions from increasingly senior managers. Several were shocked when they learned who Angela was. Others immediately began requesting reports and timelines. The atmosphere around the situation was changing rapidly. Earlier, people had spoken with certainty. Now they were asking questions. On board the aircraft, Flight 728 had finally departed. The cabin appeared calm. Passengers watched movies, read books, and settled into their journey. Captain Michael Reeves believed the matter was behind him. The aircraft was airborne. Operations had resumed. The day appeared to be returning to normal. What he did not know was that discussions about his decision were already taking place at levels of leadership he rarely encountered. Back in the chairman's office, another report arrived. Charles reviewed the latest details carefully. Several facts immediately stood out. No policy violation had been confirmed. No disruptive behavior had been documented. No formal investigation had occurred before the decision was made. The more he read, the more concerned he became. Finally, he stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the city skyline. Leadership had taught him an important lesson. Organizations reveal their true culture during moments when people possess authority over others. Those moments matter because they expose values that policies alone cannot guarantee. Charles turned back toward his desk and picked up the report once more. His expression had changed. This was no longer routine. This was no longer a simple passenger complaint. The issue had become something larger. It involved judgment, accountability, leadership, and perhaps most importantly, respect. Across the airport terminal, Angela looked out at the evening sky beyond the runway lights. Aircraft continued arriving and departing with predictable precision. Around her, travelers hurried toward destinations that mattered deeply to them. Life moved forward as always. Yet somewhere above the ordinary movement of airports and schedules, a decision was taking shape. A decision made by someone whose authority extended far beyond a single flight. And before the night was over, that decision would force an entire leadership team to confront a question they could no longer avoid. Why had certainty arrived before the facts ever did? Charles Whitmore stared at the report for several moments before placing it carefully on his desk. The room was silent except for the distant hum of city traffic beyond the glass walls of his office. Years of leadership had taught him that some decisions required patience. Others required immediate action. This was one of those moments. He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Get me the chief executive officer," he said. The response came immediately. Within minutes, senior leaders across the airline began receiving unexpected messages. Meetings were interrupted. Evening plans were postponed. Executives who believed their workday had ended suddenly found themselves reviewing reports connected to a passenger they had never met. Questions spread rapidly through the organization. Why had a passenger been removed? What evidence supported the decision? Who approved the action? Most importantly, why did the timeline reveal so many conclusions and so few verified facts? Back at the airport, Angela Carter remained seated near the terminal window. The runway lights glowed against the darkening sky while aircraft moved steadily across the airfield. She appeared completely detached from the growing activity happening behind the scenes. Her notebook rested beside her. Her phone remained silent. She seemed at peace. Nearby, Jason Murphy watched events unfold with growing disbelief. Managers were suddenly requesting records that nobody had shown interest in earlier. Statements were being collected. Communication logs were being reviewed. The atmosphere had changed completely. What began as a routine operational matter was now receiving attention from leadership levels rarely involved in airport incidents. Hundreds of miles away, the airline's chief executive officer joined a conference call with Charles Whitmore. Several members of the executive team were already present. The conversation was direct. Charles asked questions, detailed questions, questions that required facts rather than assumptions. As answers emerged, the room grew increasingly quiet. No confirmed policy violation had been documented. No disruptive conduct had been established. No formal verification process had occurred before the removal decision. Each new detail deepened the concern. Finally, Charles leaned forward. Then explain to me why this happened. No one answered immediately. Not because they were unwilling. Because nobody had a satisfactory explanation. The silence itself became the answer. Charles nodded slowly. That is what I thought. Across the call, executives exchanged uneasy glances. The chairman's voice remained calm, but everyone understood the seriousness of the situation. This is no longer about one passenger, he said. This is about leadership. It is about judgment. And it is about whether our values exist only in training manuals or in actual decisions. The words settled heavily over the conversation. Back on board the flight, Captain Michael Reeves remained unaware of the discussions taking place. The aircraft continued toward its destination. Passengers relaxed into the routine rhythm of travel. The applause from earlier felt distant now, yet the consequences of that moment were still unfolding. At the airport terminal, Angela's phone finally vibrated. She glanced at the screen and answered. The conversation lasted less than a minute. She listened more than she spoke. "Thank you," she said calmly. "I appreciate the update." Then she ended the call. Her expression did not change. Nearby, Jason noticed only a small smile before she returned her attention to the runway outside. At that exact moment, another call was being placed. Not by an airport manager. Not by a customer service representative. Not by a regional executive. The call originated from the chairman's office itself. Instructions were delivered. Meetings were scheduled. Reviews were ordered. Accountability would follow facts, not assumptions. For the first time since the incident began, the people at the highest levels of the airline possessed a complete picture of what had occurred. And as the realization spread through executive offices, one truth became impossible to ignore. The woman who had quietly walked off the aircraft with dignity had demonstrated more leadership in a few minutes than many others had shown throughout the entire day. Later that evening, Angela Carter was invited to a private meeting room inside the airport administration building. The request had come directly from senior leadership. She accepted without hesitation, not because she needed recognition, not because she wanted an apology. She accepted because meaningful change only happens when people are willing to have difficult conversations. When she entered the room, several executives were already waiting. Some stood as she arrived. Others greeted her respectfully. Their expressions revealed something that had been missing earlier in the day. Reflection. The atmosphere was professional, but it was also uncomfortable. Everyone understood why they were there. Angela took a seat at the conference table and listened as the executives summarized the findings gathered over the previous several hours. Reports had been reviewed. Timelines had been reconstructed. Employee statements had been collected. The conclusion was clear. Decisions had been made before facts had been confirmed. Assumptions had been allowed to guide actions. When the presentation ended, silence settled across the room. Finally, one executive spoke. "Ms. Carter, we regret what happened." Angela nodded politely. "Thank you." Another executive added. This situation should have been handled differently. Angela listened without interruption. She appreciated accountability, but she also understood that apologies alone could not solve larger problems. After several moments, one of the leaders asked a simple question. What would you like us to take away from this? The room became completely silent. Every person at the table focused on her response. Angela folded her hands and looked around the room. The most important lesson has nothing to do with me, she said. Several executives exchanged curious glances. Angela continued. I am fortunate. I have resources. I have influence. I have professional relationships that allowed this situation to receive attention. She paused briefly. My concern is for the people who do not. The room remained quiet. Because respect should not depend on whether someone has a title, a position, or connections. No one interrupted. Every passenger deserves fairness before anyone knows who they are. Several executives slowly nodded. Angela looked toward the large window overlooking the runway. Aircraft lights moved through the darkness beyond the glass. The real question is not how you treated a CEO. She turned back toward the room. The real question is whether this would have been considered acceptable if I were not one. No one answered. Not because they disagreed. Because the question reached deeper than policy. It reached culture, character, leadership. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Yet it felt much longer. Eventually, one executive lowered his eyes and nodded. Another quietly closed a notebook. A third simply stared at the table. Angela had given them something more valuable than criticism. She had given them a question they would remember. The meeting ended shortly afterward. As Angela prepared to leave, several executives thanked her for her honesty and professionalism. She shook hands, exchanged polite farewells, and walked toward the terminal exit. Outside, the night air felt cool and calm. The airport continued operating as it always had. Aircraft departed. Travelers arrived. Life moved forward. Yet for many people involved in the events of that day, something had changed. Jason Murphy learned the importance of speaking up when facts are missing. Several employees learned how quickly assumptions can grow when left unchallenged. Senior leaders were reminded that culture is revealed through everyday decisions, not public statements. And somewhere high above the clouds, passengers on a routine flight remained unaware that the woman they watched leave the aircraft had left behind a lesson far more important than any destination. Angela paused beside the terminal entrance and looked once more toward the runway lights. Then she smiled softly and continued walking. Because she understood something that many people spend a lifetime learning. True dignity does not come from a title. It comes from remaining true to your character even when others fail to see your worth. And true leadership begins the moment respect is offered before recognition.